The morning the HOA drained my pond wasn't marked by thunder or storms, but by the quiet hiss of pumps and the distant whine of machinery that shouldn't have been anywhere near my land. I had just eased my old pickup toward the neighborhood entrance when the gleam of freshly painted barricades blocked the private road. Two board members in neon vests stepped out as though they were security at a presidential motorcade, their crossed arms signaling I wasn't welcome. For a beat, disbelief froze me in place. I had lived here for 3 years, paid every due on time, built friendships over shared fishing trips, and tended my property with care. Yet here they were, barring me like an intruder on my own street. Beyond the barricade, I could just make out the flicker of sunlight on rippling water, or rather, the absence of it. Because what had once been my small pond glimmering like a sapphire behind my house was now a muddy scar being sucked dry by hoses that led straight toward the HOA's pristine golf green. The message was loud without a single word spoken. My peace was expendable if it kept their fairways emerald. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as a hot flush of anger crept up my neck. The HOA president, a towering woman with a perpetual tan and a reputation for ruling with the precision of a drill sergeant, stood further down the road, clipboard in hand, surveying the operation as though she were orchestrating a military campaign. Her oversized sunglasses caught the morning light like polished armor, and her lips curled in satisfaction as water from my pond gurgled through the hoses toward their thirsty turf. I eased the truck into reverse, heart pounding, humiliation simmering beneath my ribs. They had not warned me. They had not asked permission. They had simply decided that my private pond, dug, lined, and maintained with my own two hands, was theirs to sacrifice for the sake of a golf tournament scheduled for the weekend. As I turned back toward town to find another route in, my thoughts churned with disbelief and a grim sense of clarity. This was no misunderstanding or clerical error. It was deliberate, a flex of power meant to remind every homeowner that compliance was survival here. The first sting was personal loss. That pond wasn't a decorative puddle. It had been my sanctuary. Years earlier, I diverted a trickling branch of the nearby creek to fill it, spent nights under a lantern stocking it with bass and bluegill, and watched the sunset paint it bronze as my nieces squealed with delight at their first catch. Its banks had held my quiet moments and my small joys. Now it was reduced to cracked mud and exposed rocks, sacrificed so a patch of grass could look good for an afternoon of strangers swinging clubs. Driving the back roads to slip around the barricade, I caught glimpses of the community I had once idealized. Neighbors had their blinds drawn or stood on porches pretending not to see. The HOA had ruled with such intimidation for so long that even decent people had learned silence was safer than fairness. My stomach twisted at the sight of the golf green shimmering unnaturally bright from the stolen water, a gaudy emerald jewel among the dull end-of-summer grass. The hypocrisy was almost elegant in its cruelty. They preached environmental responsibility at every meeting, fined residents for overwatering their lawns, and now here they were, draining a natural pond without so much as a phone call. Parking finally in my driveway, I walked to the backyard and stared at the hollow basin that had once been alive. The fish were gone, swept away, or left gasping on damp soil. The reeds drooped like wilted flags of surrender. My boots sank slightly in the muck as I stepped closer, a bitter smell rising from the exposed bottom. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a heavy, deliberate resolve settling in my chest. Bullies like this didn't stop because you asked nicely or showed paperwork. They stopped when someone proved they weren't untouchable. My mind flicked through the bylaws binder stored in my office drawer, through the creek that still ran quietly through the woods, and through every underhanded trick I had seen this HOA pull on others. A slow, grim smile tugged at my lips despite the rage boiling beneath. They had taken my pond for their landscaping. But water has a way of finding its path again, and I had a plan forming already, a plan that would leave their perfect world soaked and sputtering. Somewhere under the shame and fury, anticipation sparked. The balance of power would not stay tilted forever, and when it shifted, it would do so with the force of a flood that evening. As the last light bled out across the treetops, I stood at the edge of the creek that once fed my pond and let the cool rush of water numb my fingertips. The woods around me were quiet except for the chirp of crickets and the faint whisper of the current, but inside my mind the storm was gathering. I pictured the HOA's Gulf green gleaming under floodlights, fed by stolen water, and every smug glance the board members had ever given me replayed like a taunt. Years of compliance and good faith had earned me nothing but humiliation. In the fading dusk, a single frog croaked from the mud flats that used to be my pond, and something inside me clicked into place like a lock turning. The bylaws I'd read before signing my mortgage came back to me. The creek's flow was not HOA property, and its use could not be altered without unanimous homeowner consent. They had ignored their own rules to drain my sanctuary. Rules, I realized, are a two-edged blade. Useless if you only follow them while your oppressor doesn't. The next morning, I drove to the county archives, a beige building with flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of old paper. There, among brittle maps and water rights records, I confirmed what I suspected. The HOA's right to use water was strictly limited to their wells and approved irrigation, not natural bodies. The golf course, as lush as they loved it, was already pushing those limits. I copied everything, tucking the documents into a folder like ammunition. But legal arguments alone wouldn't reclaim what was stolen. I needed to shift perception, to expose their hypocrisy, to remind my neighbors that power only worked if they let themselves be cowed. So, I started quietly. At the bait shop, I mentioned how the fish in my pond had been sucked dry for someone's putting surface. At the coffee stand near the highway, I lamented how the HOA preached conservation while pumping a private pond empty. People listened, their eyebrows lifting, whispers spreading like ripples in a pond. By midweek, sympathetic glances replaced the earlier avoidance, though nobody dared speak against the board openly. They had seen what happened to others who challenged authority. One family had been fined for hanging a simple tire swing without permission. Another had been dragged through hearings over a flower bed that dared to include non-approved blooms. The community had been ruled by fear long enough that silence felt safer than outrage. But fear cracks when someone stands without flinching. Late one night, I returned to the creek with a lantern and a shovel. The creek's natural bend meandered past my property before curving toward the HOA's underground irrigation intake, the same intake they had expanded illegally years ago. I measured the ground, studying the slope, and realized that a simple diversion, one that would stay entirely on my land and follow the contours nature already carved, could shift the flow enough to starve there. Pumps while rerouting water back to refill my basin. The idea wasn't vandalism. It was correction, restoring what was stolen. Still, I moved carefully, knowing bullies strike hardest when they sense defiance. By dawn, a shallow channel had begun to form under my quiet work, water whispering into its new path with a promise of return. In the days that followed, the golf green's perfect emerald began to dull under the sun. The pumps whined louder, struggling against a reduced flow. Karen, the HOA president, responded by doubling down on control. Flyers appeared on every mailbox warning of water theft and community sabotage. They summoned an emergency meeting, urging neighbors to remain vigilant against disruptive elements. Yet cracks were forming in her empire. Bob from down the street, who had suffered her nitpicking over his garden shed, muttered in the hardware store that perhaps the board should investigate their own illegal intake before accusing others. The Martins quietly thanked me for speaking up when nobody else would, their voices tinged with the relief of long-suppressed resentment. The golf green grew patchy and brown in circles where sprinklers sputtered, and whispers of rebellion grew louder. I bided my time, letting Karen's paranoia work against her. The more she threatened and accused, the more people remembered her past abuses, the fines for holiday decorations, the inspections for mailbox paint, the petty power plays that turned neighbors into subjects. Each evening, I walked to the newly filling pond, its muddy bottom softening under the returning water, and watched dragonflies skim the surface. The reflection of the sky on that growing mirror reminded me why I was fighting. It wasn't just about revenge or even justice. It was about reclaiming peace and dignity. I knew Karen would escalate before she crumbled. Bullies always do. But I was ready, and this time I held the current, the documents, and the quiet support of a community beginning to wake from fear. The creek's song was changing now, a subtle shift that only I could fully appreciate, and with it came the steady beat of resolve. They had drained my pond for landscaping glory, but the tide was turning, and soon their manicured green would feel what it meant to be at the mercy of forces they couldn't control. By the following weekend, the HOA's polished veneer had begun to fracture, the once pristine golf green now blotched with dry, ochre-colored scars that no amount of sprinkler adjustment could disguise. I spent my mornings pretending to tinker with my truck in the driveway while observing the parade of anxious board members pacing the course like generals surveying a battlefield gone wrong. The faint hum of their pumps had become a desperate whine, a sound that told me the diversion was working quietly, invisibly, like water carving stone over time. But I understood that humiliation alone wouldn't end Karen's reign. She thrived on fear, and until the neighborhood saw her hypocrisy laid bare, she would continue wielding her clipboard like a crown. The next step required precision. I gathered the evidence I had copied at the county archives, maps showing the limits of HOA water rights, old meeting minutes revealing their unapproved expansion of the intake line, and photographs of their machinery siphoning from my drained pond. I cataloged every page into a binder thick enough to rival a legal brief. At the hardware store, I overheard two neighbors whispering about the golf green's sudden decline, and when they noticed me, they exchanged knowing looks. One murmured that perhaps it was karma, a word that landed softly but carried weight. In the evenings, I sat on the growing shoreline of my recovering pond, the water now lapping at stones that had been dry a week before, and let the cool breeze erase the anger's edge, sharpening it into resolve instead. I remembered every small injustice Karen had inflicted on others: the family fined for leaving a basketball hoop overnight, the elderly couple forced to repaint shutters for a barely perceptible hue difference, the single mother threatened with penalties because her flower pots didn't match the approved earth tones. My plan wasn't just retaliation for myself, but a reckoning for all of them. Quietly, I arranged for the county water inspector to visit on Monday under the pretense of routine review. I knew what he would find: an unauthorized pump line running directly from the creek through HOA property, something Karen had bragged about installing years ago when she believed her power unassailable. On Sunday night, the sky opened with a heavy summer rain that drenched the forest and sent the creek roaring. I walked its bank in the darkness, lanterns swinging, and saw the new channel I'd carved swell confidently, sending a torrent toward my pond. The water cascaded down like applause, its forceful rush both soothing and exhilarating. By dawn, my pond shimmered under a rising sun, fuller than it had been in months, while the HOA's intake sputtered uselessly. That afternoon, I drove past the golf green slowly, meeting the stares of board members whose voices carried frustration over the hum of failing pumps. Karen stood among them, arms crossed, lips pressed into a hard line, her sunglasses unable to hide the twitch of doubt flickering across her face. Still, she tried to project control, ordering workers to adjust sprinklers, blaming equipment, even suggesting sabotage by rogue elements. But the brown patches spreading across the fairway told a different story. The inspector arrived the next day, clipboard in hand, and spent an hour tracing pipes and photographing connections. By the time he left, whispers had turned to open speculation. Neighbors began visiting my porch under the guise of casual conversation, their eyes alight with quiet approval. One remarked on how peaceful my pond looked now, as if nature herself was correcting an injustice. Another said it was remarkable how fast water rights violations came back to bite the guilty. I simply nodded, letting the narrative grow on its own. By midweek, the HOA plastered urgent notices on every mailbox demanding conservation and threatening penalties for anyone caught diverting water. Thinly veiled accusations aimed squarely at me. Yet for the first time, residents didn't cower. A few laughed at the absurdity, others crumpled the notices without a second glance. The Martins, usually reserved, deliberately placed a birdbath by their front steps, filling it to the brim in quiet defiance. I felt a shift in the air, a collective exhale of neighbors who were finally willing to imagine a world without Karen's grip. Still, I knew the board president wouldn't surrender gracefully. Bullies, cornered, tend to lash out rather than step aside. As twilight settled over the lake that Thursday, I spotted her pacing near the dried-out green, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. The first stars blinked above as thunder rolled faintly in the distance, promising another storm. I could almost feel the inevitability of the final confrontation building like pressure behind a dam. The creek murmured beside my property, steady and sure, and my pond gleamed like a reclaimed crown. In that quiet moment, surrounded by crickets and the earthy scent of wet soil, I knew the climax was near. Karen would strike again, but when she did, she would find the current already turned against her, the community no longer silent, and the rules she once twisted now forming a noose around her authority. The flood she feared was not just water. It was the uprising of every neighbor she had silenced. And soon, her manicured world of control would be swept clean. Friday dawned with a brittle tension that even the birds seemed to sense, their morning songs subdued as clouds gathered above the neighborhood. By mid-morning, the HOA had posted another round of flyers calling an emergency meeting for that evening. Bold lettering warning of unauthorized interference with community resources. The notice dripped with the same arrogance that had fueled every petty infraction they'd ever issued. But this time the neighbors weren't grumbling in silence. When I walked past the mailboxes, I saw crumpled copies tossed into bins and quiet smirks exchanged between residents who had once kept their heads down. The community was waking up, and Karen didn't see the shift happening beneath her feet. By the time the meeting began, the recreation hall was packed tighter than I'd ever seen. Folding chairs lined every wall, and the air buzzed with restless energy. Karen stood at the front in a sharp blazer and perfectly styled hair, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Behind her, the board members shuffled uneasily, their confidence fraying. The golf green had become an embarrassing patchwork of brown, and the county inspector's report had already begun circulating through whispered conversations. I remained at the back, binder of evidence pressed under my arm like a final stone in a carefully stacked dam. As Karen launched into her familiar speech about community integrity and protecting property values, the room shifted uncomfortably. Her words, once delivered with commanding certainty, now sounded hollow against the backdrop of glaring hypocrisy. Several neighbors began murmuring about the unapproved pump line, and one man even held up a printout of the county's violation notice for others to see. I stepped forward slowly, not to argue or shout, but to stand where everyone could see me, the binder visible but unopened. The weight of the room tilted without a word spoken, power moving from her to the collective realization of those she'd bullied for years. Outside, a low rumble of thunder rolled closer, and the smell of rain seeped through the open windows. The first drops began to fall just as the inspector himself entered, carrying additional documents that confirmed the HOA's unauthorized water use and the county's intent to impose fines. The crowd gasped softly, then erupted into quiet, nervous laughter. The timing was perfect. The storm broke fully as lightning flashed across the sky, and a sheet of rain swept over the golf course outside, hammering the parched turf and rushing toward the low-lying green. But the creek, now following its natural, redirected path, didn't feed their drains as it once had. The downpour collected and pooled, unable to disperse fast enough. And within minutes water began to flood across the fairway, spreading into the perfectly groomed bunkers and fairways until the golf green lay submerged like a drowned crown. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As neighbors crowded to the windows, astonished laughter mingled with gasps at the sight of the HOA's pride sinking under muddy water. The very arrogance that had led them to steal from my pond had left them vulnerable to the forces they couldn't control. Karen's voice faltered, her usual authority dissolving in the chorus of disbelief around her. The board members quietly stepped back, unwilling to stand beside her as the reality settled in. The inspector reminded the room, almost apologetically, that the county would not only fine the HOA but also require restoration of all altered water channels, an expense that would fall squarely on the board's mismanagement. Outside, the rain intensified, and the creek continued its new course, my pond now brimming and alive again, fish darting beneath the restored surface as though nothing had ever disturbed them. By the next morning, the story had spread through every household. Karen's perfect kingdom had drowned in its own hypocrisy. Neighbors who had once been silent approached my porch with small smiles and cautious congratulations. The Martins brought fresh bread, Bob offered to help reinforce the pond's banks, and a family I barely knew thanked me for standing up when no one else dared. The board called another meeting, But this time the turnout was smaller, the tone subdued. One by one, members distanced themselves from Karen until a motion for a vote of no confidence passed easily, her presidency dissolving in the same room where she had once ruled.